In a frozen corner of occupied China, there was no gunfire, no battle cries, only silence. Behind tall wooden fences, Japanese doctors in white coats performed experiments that even their own soldiers were forbidden to witness. They called it the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. In truth, it was a laboratory of death. For years, the screams of prisoners vanished into the winter wind, and no one outside ever knew this place existed, until the war ended and the silence finally spoke. Fact 1. The village that vanished. In 1936, near Harbin in Manchuria, an entire Chinese village disappeared. Locals said trucks arrived at night, soldiers surrounded the area, and by morning nothing remained. No people, no sound. Later, witnesses recalled that the land was fenced off, guarded by men who spoke only in whispers. Inside that perimeter, Unit 731 was born. What looked like a research center was actually a biological weapons facility. Scientists studied how disease could be turned into a weapon: cholera, plague, anthrax. The villagers who once farmed that soil were the first test subjects. The camp's nickname among locals was the Factory of Ghosts. No one who entered it ever returned. Fact 2. The Doctors of the Emperor. The men of Unit 731 were not criminals in the eyes of Japan. They were doctors, graduates of Tokyo's best universities, chosen for their intelligence and loyalty. Their commander, General Shiro Ishii, told them they were serving science and the Emperor himself. In white uniforms, they walked through corridors filled with cages, glass tanks, and restrained bodies. They spoke in medical terms, but what they did was far from medicine. They froze limbs to study frostbite, injected prisoners with viruses, and dissected them alive to see how organs react. Ishii promised his men glory and immunity. Most believed him. After all, in war, they were told, a human body was just another battlefield. Fact 3. The air of innocence. To the outside world, the camp seemed peaceful. Trains passed nearby, and guards smiled at passing civilians. Official signs described it as a water purification laboratory. Even the Red Cross once received reports praising its sanitary research. Inside, however, the air smelled of chemicals and decay. Prisoners, mostly Chinese, Koreans, and Russians, were called logs. They were kept in numbered cells, studied like lab animals. When epidemics broke out, the unit secretly released infected fleas into nearby villages to observe the spread. Entire towns sickened and died. No records listed the victims by name, only by case number. Silence was the last sound they heard. Fact 4. The morning without shadows. Every morning in Pingfang, the sun rose over the snow but never reached inside the fences. The prisoners, farmers, teachers, even children were awakened before dawn. Guards in fur-lined coats led them to concrete halls where the temperature was kept below freezing. There, doctors studied how cold could kill a man without breaking his skin. Limbs were soaked in icy water until the flesh turned white as porcelain. Some prisoners were ordered to wave their frozen arms until they shattered. The doctors wrote notes, measured, and moved on to the next cell. Outside, the smell of burned paper mixed with the bitter air. They called it frostbite research. The subjects called it the season without shadows, because those who left the cell no longer cast one. Fact 5. The plague bomb. In a hidden hangar near the camp, engineers built a strange weapon, a porcelain bomb filled with fleas carrying bubonic plague. These bombs were tested not on dummies or targets, but on living villages. Planes flew over China's countryside, dropping what looked like harmless dust. Days later, people began to die in agony. Entire towns were erased from the map, recorded only as successful field trials. The soldiers who handled the bombs wore gas masks, yet many of them fell sick too. When one mechanic begged to be treated, his superior told him coldly, "You've been promoted from soldier to specimen." No monument marks those fields today. Only grass grows over the graves of 1,000 invisible experiments. Fact 6. The Code of Silence. Every man in Unit 731 signed an oath, not of loyalty, but of silence. They were forbidden to speak of their work, even to their families. Letters home were censored. Soldiers who asked questions disappeared. When one young doctor, horrified by what he saw, tried to resign, he was told that the emperor's work did not allow retirement. "Science demands sacrifice," his superior said, "and we are scientists." Many began drinking heavily, their hands trembling even during routine dissections. Yet they continued, trapped between obedience and conscience. Those who doubted were reminded that Japan was fighting for survival, and that mercy in wartime was treason. Fact 7. The Children's Ward. Behind a door labelled Experimental Nursery were rooms that few ever entered twice. Here, Unit 731 conducted tests on infants born to female prisoners. Some babies were deliberately infected with cholera or plague to study maternal transmission. Others were starved to observe nutritional thresholds. The mothers were forced to watch in silence. When the tests ended, the doctors made careful notes, closed the files, and burned the bodies in the same furnace as the waste. One witness, decades later, said he still remembered the sound, not of screaming, but of lullabies. The nurses sang them to keep the children calm, their voices trembling as smoke rose from the chimney. Fact 8. The Man Who Smiled Too Much. Among the staff, one man stood out, a cheerful surgeon named Lieutenant Kawashima. He was always smiling, even during autopsies. To his subordinates, he seemed immune to horror. "We're not killing," he once said. "We're learning." When the war ended, Kawashima escaped to Tokyo and became a professor of medicine. He lectured students about anatomy using knowledge gained from the camp. None of them knew where he had learned it. Years later, when journalists asked about Unit 731, he replied with a smile, "We did what every scientist dreams of. Experiments without limits." His words froze the room. For the first time, even his smile looked sick. Fact 9. The Orders from Tokyo. By 1944, Japan was losing the war. But in the cold halls of Pingfang, the experiments only grew darker. New orders came from Tokyo. Accelerate research on plague deployment. Ishii's men began testing on captured Soviet prisoners, believing their stronger bodies would provide better data. The camp ran day and night. Doctors injected new bacteria strains and recorded how long it took before death. Some victims were given antibiotics just to observe the moment resistance failed. Outside, trains arrived carrying crates labeled agricultural supplies. Inside were humans, stripped and numbered. No one spoke their names. The closer Japan moved toward defeat, the more desperate Ishii became to finish his master formula. The war might be ending, but his obsession had just begun. Fact 10. The day the birds fell. In late spring of 1945, villagers near Harbin noticed a strange sight. Flocks of crows dropping dead from the sky. The cause was a new experiment. Infected fleas released into the air to test whether birds could carry disease over distance. The project failed, but the results spread in another way. Soon, local farmers began dying from an unknown fever. The unit documented everything: body temperatures, burial times, infection radius. To them, it was data. To the villagers, it was a curse. When Japanese soldiers returned to collect the samples, even they wore double masks. One officer wrote in his notebook, "The smell of death here is heavier than snow." Those notes were never meant to be read, but they survived, like the sickness itself. Fact 11. The furnace beneath the floor. As the Red Army advanced, panic began to seep into the corridors of Unit 731. Trucks arrived loaded with files, bones, and medical instruments. Everything was burned in underground furnaces built for waste disposal. Prisoners were executed by injection or blade. Their remains fed the flames. Doctors who had dissected hundreds of bodies now destroyed their own reports by the thousands. Ishii ordered, "Erase everything. There was never a Unit 731. Some guards fled into the forest, others shot themselves beside the burning pits. One technician recalled the silence afterward. No screams, no engines, just fire and wind. By August 1945, the camp stood empty, its laboratories glowing faintly under a red sky. The empire of silence had buried its own truth. Fact 12. The bargain for immunity. When Japan surrendered, General Shiro Ishii vanished. For months, the Americans searched for him, suspecting he held secrets about biological warfare. When they finally found him, Ishii offered a deal: full cooperation in exchange for protection. The United States accepted. All data from Unit 731, frostbite tests, plague trials, gas experiments, were shipped to American laboratories. None of the doctors faced trial. While German scientists were judged in Nuremberg, Ishii's men were given new jobs and new names. Some worked in hospitals. Others helped design post-war vaccines. Only a handful ever spoke of what they had done. "We were told we served our country," one former assistant whispered years later. But the country we served no longer existed, and neither did our souls. Fact 13. The doctor in the white suit. In the early 1950s, a quiet man wearing a white suit walked the streets of Tokyo. To the public, he was Dr. Shiro Ishii, a retired researcher giving lectures about public health. No one knew he was the same man who once commanded the Camp of Silence. His audience saw a polite, educated gentleman. Only a few recognized the shadow behind the smile. Rumors spread among the medical community, whispers about his Manchurian work. Some said he carried a small notebook wherever he went, filled with formulas written in code. When asked about the war, he simply said, "Science knows no war, only discovery." His students applauded, unaware that every applause echoed through the ghosts of Pingfang. Fact 14. The glass bottles in the river. In 1956, Chinese farmers ploughing near Harbin unearthed dozens of glass bottles buried along the riverbank. Each was sealed with wax and marked with faded Japanese characters. Inside were preserved organs, labelled with dates from 1943 and 1944. Local police called it a crime scene, but no one could identify the victims. The bodies had long turned to dust, but the samples remained perfect. When news reached Tokyo, it was quickly dismissed as enemy propaganda. Yet among the bottles was one with a label still legible: fetus, 4 months, mother, subject 311. That single line said everything about what the empire had hidden. The jars were quietly collected and taken away. No official report was ever published. Fact 15. The whisper in the classroom. By the 1960s, a few Japanese medical students began to suspect their professors were not ordinary men. One afternoon, during anatomy class, a student asked about tissue samples that seemed unusually preserved. The old professor paused, then whispered, "They're from Harbin." He never explained further. Years later, that same student became a journalist and began investigating the legend of Unit 731. What he uncovered shook Japan's self-image. A network of scientists, protected by the government, who had quietly built their post-war careers on wartime atrocities. But publishing the truth dangerous. When his articles appeared, his editor received threats, his family was harassed, and his university sources disappeared. The whisper had become a warning. Fact 16. The trial that never happened. In 1949, in the Soviet city of Khabarovsk, a handful of Japanese officers were put on trial for war crimes related to biological warfare. The proceedings revealed gruesome details: plague bombs, vivisections, human freezing tests. But most of the world ignored it, believing the trial was Soviet propaganda. The Americans, who already possessed Ishii's research, remained silent. For decades, survivors' testimonies were dismissed, and official archives stayed sealed. The doctors of Unit 731 lived long lives. Some died peacefully in their beds. One even received a medal for services to science. The victims, meanwhile, had no graves, no records, and no justice. In history books, the page about them was simply left blank, as if silence could erase what happened. Fact 17. The man who couldn't forget. In 1978, an elderly Japanese medic named Ken Yuasa broke the silence. For decades, he had lived as a country doctor, treating farmers and children. But one night, after years of nightmares, he confessed in a public meeting that he had performed live dissections on Chinese prisoners under Unit 731. The audience froze. Some shouted that he was lying. Others wept. Yuasa kept speaking, not to seek forgiveness, but because, as he said, the silence was heavier than guilt. His confession inspired others to speak. Former nurses, technicians, and guards began to come forward, their stories trembling but consistent. They described the same cold rooms, the same smell, the same feeling. That humanity had ended there, replaced by obedience in a white coat. Fact 18. The bones beneath Tokyo. In 1989, construction workers digging in Tokyo's Shinjuku district found something strange. Dozens of human bones buried beneath the foundations of a medical school. Some skulls had holes drilled into them. Others bore surgical marks. Forensic experts estimated the remains dated back to the 1940s. The government promised an investigation, but within weeks the site was sealed and the bones quietly removed. No final report was released. Former officials whispered that the remains belonged to Unit 731's post-war sample storage, transferred from Manchuria before Japan's surrender. The discovery caused a brief scandal, then faded into silence. Like so many other fragments of truth that surfaced only to be buried again, the city kept building, layer upon layer, over its unacknowledged dead. Fact 19. The museum without a name. In the 1990s, China opened a small, stark museum in Harbin, on the site where Unit 731 once stood. It wasn't grand or cinematic, just cold halls, concrete floors, and glass cases filled with rusted instruments. Visitors walked through rooms with peeling paint and smelled the faint odor of chemical dust. In one corner stood the original incinerator door, blackened, twisted, still reeking of ash. Survivors' testimonies played on an old television, their voices trembling, translated into 3 languages. There was no gift shop, no comfort. The guide simply said, "This is not a place to look, it is a place to remember." Each year, fewer survivors come, but their faces linger in photographs, staring at the visitors who will never truly understand what those walls once saw. Fact 20. The shadows in the textbooks. Even today, most Japanese school textbooks devote barely a paragraph to Unit 731, if they mention it at all. Many young people have never heard of it. Teachers who try to discuss it face complaints, sometimes even dismissal. It's too dark, officials say, too controversial, but history that is hidden does not vanish. It waits. Every few years, a journalist or filmmaker uncovers new documents, a diary, a photograph, a forgotten report, proving again that the camp was real. In China, children grow up learning the name Pingfang as a scar. In Japan, it remains a whisper. The silence continues, but the ground remembers. Beneath the soil, beneath the snow, the truth still breathes, waiting for a generation brave enough to face it. Fact 21. The photograph that shouldn't exist. In 2017, a faded roll of film was found in an abandoned Tokyo apartment. Inside were 13 photographs never meant to be seen. Men in white coats standing around a table, surgical instruments gleaming under bare bulbs. Their faces are calm, almost proud. In one frame, you can see the insignia of Unit 731 stitched on a sleeve. The man in the center, unmistakably Shiro Ishii, looks straight at the camera. Historians verified the negatives as authentic, taken between 1941 and 1943. For the first time, the ghosts had faces. The photos were displayed briefly at a small exhibit in Kyoto, before being removed to prevent public unrest. But for those who saw them, the silence of decades shattered in a single click of a shutter. Fact 22. The wind over Pingfang. Today, the site of Unit 731 lies quiet again. The fences are gone, the laboratories are ruins overgrown with grass. In winter, the wind moves through broken windows, howling softly through the corridors where no one walks. Locals say you can still hear the faint metallic clink of chains when snow begins to fall. The camp's own memory, breathing. Each year, survivors' families come with paper lanterns and set them adrift in the nearby river. They don't pray for revenge. They pray that people remember. That somewhere, in a classroom, a student will ask what really happened. Because the dead have no voice. Only those who dare to listen. The story of Unit 731 is not about monsters. It's about humans who forgot they were human. In the end, their silence lasted longer than their empire. But silence does not erase truth. Somewhere in the frozen soil of Manchuria, the echo remains. A reminder that the line between medicine and murder can vanish when obedience becomes faith, and when science forgets its soul.